true story of one of the great escapes of the Second World War, now on BBC Wales On 2, recounted by those who lived to tell the astonishing tale.
To all prisoners of war, the escape from prison camps is no longer a sport. Urgent warning is given against making future escapes. In plain English, stay in the camp, where you will be safe. Breaking out of it is now a damn dangerous act. The chances of preserving your life are almost nil. Escaping from prison camps has ceased to be a sport.
This is the true story of Operation Escape 200, better known as the Great Escape. It took place in March 1944, but what began with heady optimism ended in tragedy when 50 Royal Air Force officers were murdered by the Gestapo.
Berkland, Rettel, Bull, Bushel.
The deaths marked a turning point in German attitudes towards Allied prisoners of war. With an invasion on the horizon, the Nazi authorities were no longer prepared to look leniently on escapers at large within the Reich.
Until the Great Escape, you escaped, you got caught, you spent a week or 14 days in a cooler, you came out to the applause of your friends and the cheers of everybody else, and that was it. It was only after the murder of the 50 that it became literally deadly serious.
The Great Escape took place through a tunnel dug out of Stalag Luft III, one of a complex of prison camps near the German town of Sargen.
We are now in something that used to be Germany before the war, Silesia, which was taken over by the Poles in 1945, and all the Germans were thrown out westwards, and Sargan is now called Żagań. It was a long way. I mean, if you look at the map and if you think of where Luft III is and where England is, or even Norway, it's a long, long way from home.
Years after the breakout, ex-Royal Air Force prisoners of war Andrew Wiseman, Sidney Dowse and Ken Rees returned to Sargan to relive the story of the escape and pay their respects to the dead.
And your answer should be, give me your wife and I'll find out.
Well, this is a book that I'm kind of think the absolute world of. Actually, we used to ask people to do little things for us, a drawing or a poem or a cartoon. That's me, unfortunately. I had a moustache in those days. That is Johnny Bull, actually, who was in my room, a great character, one of the leading diggers in the tunnel, and he was one of the 50, unfortunately, who was shot. And that shook me more than anything else when he was murdered, actually.
A toast to the 50 officers.
And maybe drink to our absent friends.
Absent friends.
Za tych 50, których zamordowani byli.
I żeby te czasy się nie wróciły.
And so that these days should never return.
Na zdrowie.
The journey to captivity for most RAF prisoners of war began from a runway somewhere in England. The men who appear in this programme were in their early 20s when they took off on their fateful last sorties to Germany. They were among thousands of young Allied flyers who survived the trauma of shoot-down to spend most of their war behind barbed wire.
After about 10 minutes of throwing the aircraft all over the place, trying to get out of the searchlights without success, one of the rear gunners said, "Messerschmitt on our tail, skipper." A lot of smell, a lot of fumes, one engine caught fire, and rocking wings and shouting bail out and so on. I was unable to get more than about half of my body out of the cockpit. But I suppose eventually, as the aircraft went into a very steep dive, the air pressure was enough to force the hood back, and out I went.
There was an almighty thump which nearly tore me apart, and then I was just floating in the stillness above the dark Dutch landscape. And I could see two rivers shining in the moonlight down below.
As I came down into a field with some trees around, I realized that there was movement beneath me.
I felt rather like a disembodied spirit. I wasn't quite sure whether I was alive or dead. Suddenly grounded, a very sharp transition.
In 1941, Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, ordered the construction of a new prison camp to house the increasing numbers of Allied flyers being shot down over occupied Europe. The camp was to be relatively comfortable, reflecting Goering's ambivalent respect for the RAF. But it was also to be secure, a requirement that overlooked the fact that the camp was situated on sand. Nature has long since reclaimed the site of Stalag Luft III, but in 1944 nearly 5,000 Allied airmen were housed in the wooden huts that once stood here. For the last 10 years, Jerzy von Charuk, curator of the Museum of Martyrology at Żagań, has been unearthing the traces of those that endured life in the camp.
Jest tego naprawdę na tym terenie jeszcze bardzo wiele. Oczywiście wszystko to jest bardzo mocno zniszczone, no ale niestety stanowi to pewne źródło historii, ponieważ za każdym z tych przedmiotów stał kiedyś stał żywy człowiek, który nie wiadomo, czy do dnia dzisiejszego jeszcze przetrwał.
I mean, you were 12 people in a room for 24 hours a day, and you didn't get on with some people. I remember one Dutchman who slept on the bunk above me. Every morning he used to hang his feet over the bunk and put his clogs on my chest and then clog to the window and spit and say, "Another bloody day in this godforsaken country." And he said, "Why don't you come outside, we'll have a chat." So we went outside, and I said, "Please stop doing it." And he said, "Look, Andy, you talk too much, and that gets on my nerves too, so let's learn to live with each other." And that's what it was really all about, learning to live with each other, because you couldn't get out. Those who went to English public schools found it really more acceptable because it was cold, the food was lousy, and there were no women.
The thing that people seem to miss least and talk about least were drink and sex.
Women, not sex.
Well,
Women.
women. Well, most of us call that sex.
Mind you, we played a lot of rugby, we played a lot of games.
That was the cookhouse, wasn't it?
That's right.
And that building at the end is the theatre. The Germans allowed us to build a theatre. They supplied the material, and we did all the work. And when I say we did all the work, I did nothing at all. The keen, arty people all got together and they built this. It really was a beautiful theatre. These are some of the plays that they put on, actually. So we did have some better women. I don't know whether I've got any photographs of the better birds.
was all part of the Germans' idea of if there were amenities, the prisoners of war would stay in the compound and wouldn't attempt to escape. So within reason, they were prepared to make things available. With some help from other people, I used to put on 2 concerts a week in the theatre. So I was absolutely shameless, anything I could do to get gramophone records. Eventually, we had something like 3,500 gramophone records. We had sets of all the major works, all the concertos, nearly all the symphonies and so on. For me, it was an enormous help to surviving in a prison camp. In fact, without the music, my life would have been very different. And I think, hopefully, that for a lot of other people as well, the ability to lose yourself in music was a major asset.
Compared to Auschwitz and Belsen and Sachsenhausen, Luft III was a holiday camp. I mean, compared to the concentration camps. Yes, I think one felt one was reasonably lucky.
Stalag Luft III may have been relatively comfortable, but it was certainly not secure. Many prisoners chose to tolerate captivity and stay put, but just as many were determined to escape and get home. Digging was the favoured way out.
The third one, is it?
Yeah.
Where's the hydrant?
Across this road, into these, across the Vorlager into the woods here. We should have come out into those woods over there.
Within months of the opening of the camp, the sand beneath the huts had become riddled with numerous small tunnels as hundreds of airmen began burrowing to freedom.
9, 10, 30 feet.
Come on, Sydney.
Which way? 1.
But few of these early attempts were successful.
This way? Why this way?
Just through here. Let's see if we can see anything we can.
The idea of a well-organised mass breakout was the brainchild of Roger Bushell, a charismatic South African who had already escaped several times.
It had been decided by Roger Bushell and the senior British officer that only 3 tunnels were to be built. No other tunnelling was to be countenanced, and the whole thing was more or less nationalised, so to speak, under one umbrella. The tunnels would be dug simultaneously. They'd all be 30 foot in depth, the vertical shafts. Tom, Dick and Harry, they were named. Only 3 tunnels were to be built. If 1 was caught, there'd still be 2. If 2 were caught, there'd still be 1, you see. The safety in numbers, so to speak.
Here's some bricks and mortar.
Work commenced on all 3 tunnels simultaneously in the summer of 1943. Tom progressed most quickly, but in spite of all the precautions, it was found by the Germans in October.
Now, what was this supposed to be?
To give the impression that there were no more tunnels, Bushell now ordered a temporary halt to work on Dick and Harry.
Would this be a hut? This would be 104. That's where the entrance would be.
In January 1944, work restarted. But this time, all resources were channeled into the completion of 1 tunnel, Harry, which went from beneath Hut 104.
You don't feel like starting to dig now, do you?
The key to success lay in the skillful disguising of the tunnel entrance. The trapdoor to Harry was concealed beneath the tiled base of the stove.
The German stove that heated the room, and you could cook on a little bit, would be sitting on top of this. And that would be keeping us warm, so cold. And as you can see here, all they had to take these tiles off, first of all, and then reassemble these tiles into a platform to make the top so that the Germans wouldn't be able to see it.
I don't think it occurred to them that we could get through the concrete. You know, we'd have tools to get through concrete into the ground. And the shaft itself was about 2 foot square. So that went straight down, so you had kind of 6 inches of solid cement all round. So when they came in looking for tunnels, they could probe anywhere, but they couldn't get in there. This is the person who was actually digging the tunnel and was digging away with tin. And he brought the sand back behind him and pushed it back.
The face man would work his way up to the front. He would scrape away at the cold face, as it were, the sand face, until he had enough room to put in a frame. The frames really were designed to stop the sand above from falling down into the tunnel rather than actually supporting the weight of the sand.
There were a lot of people who wanted to dig, but there's no place for them because we had to have what we called experienced diggers, like Ken. An experienced digger is somebody who, even if he hasn't done a little bit of digging, has an aptitude for it. And he can do it. He can go straight. He knows exactly where he's going. He doesn't start going down to Australia or up to heaven. And he knows exactly where he's going.
Well, I think I got onto the digging team because I was being Welsh, and when I walked into the room, they obviously thought I was a Welsh miner. But despite all this straight, of course, the tunnel was not dead straight.
No.
Or dead level. It went down a bit and it went up, and you could tell that when you were pulling the trolleys back.
The trolleys were constructed in an underground workshop at the bottom of the main shaft. They ran on wooden rails and were used for hauling the sand back.
The trolley itself, if you looked at it, was a very simple, elementary thing, the kind of thing that almost like a child's toy. But to produce it, and to produce one that could stand up to the wear and tear and carry the load, as it turned out the weight of a man, was quite an achievement. Escaping activity was an occupational therapy that had some objective at the end. You knew very well that the prospects of getting out and getting back to England were very, very slim, but it was an objective, a clear-cut objective.
There were something like 500 people involved, and one of the most important jobs was upstairs, and that's why a lot of people never ever got down into the tunnel, because upstairs you had to have hundreds of chaps, literally hundreds of chaps, who were following the Germans and just watching the Germans and finding out where they were going to go and making signals if any of the ferrets suddenly came in and started heading towards the particular hut in which the tunnel was.
There were certain prisoners who were all fluent German speakers who were allocated certain German guards, and they worked on these things over months and so on, and got into their confidence, and actually in some cases got these guards almost completely in their control, so that they, by bribery and threats and all sorts of things, they managed to get things like files and drills and even cameras, because you see, in order to produce these forged documents, there had to be photographs on these things, and so there was a camera and a photographic studio. That was all part of the escape organization.
The good thing was the tremendous ability that people showed, the tremendous talents that people had when it came to making passes or taking clothes and converting uniform into civilian clothes. The tremendous talents of ordinary people were unbelievable.
Engineers, surveyors, mathematicians, carpenters, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, you see. And so this, you know, it wasn't very difficult to get somebody who knew about making an air pump or making a wheel, or, you know, hooking up with the Third Reich's electricity.
Let's have a go at this. Be a bigger piece than that. But if that is warmed up carefully over a stove, it becomes pliable. So you can bend it up into the form of a compass, and the material is non-metallic and therefore doesn't affect the magnetic part, which is a sliver of razor blade sitting on a pin. All escapers need compasses.
You see, there's your sand immediately under this. This is the only bit of solid earth we had. And then you had all this sand here, see? And you kick that like mad and you'll get sand and sand and sand and sand, nothing but sand.
You had to get the sand hidden, because if you just literally put a handful of it down on this type of surface, it would stand out. Getting rid of the sand was the trouble. They tried lots of different ways to start with. The popular one was they had two sausages down the legs of their trousers with a clip at the bottom with the string going into the pockets.
And in your pockets, you pulled the catches and you just kept on walking. And you would shake your legs and shake your legs, do that sort of thing. And then you were just walking around and shuffling about and just spreading the sand. And when the bags were empty, then you came back for some more bags and did it all over again.
So he'd just go around with his hands in his pockets, opening the bottom when it was all clear, and then he could close it if he saw any goons about, you see. It worked, well, extremely well. They disposed of 130 tons that summer.
This is the theatre. Yes, this looks like it. Because it had bricks right down to the ground. It was the one place that the Germans couldn't crawl under. And under the floor of the auditorium was a great hollow space waiting to be filled up with sand. All along here, as you can imagine, sloping away, and was excellent.
The biggest distance they dug was 14 feet in one day. And that filled 98 kit bags, 4.5 tons, and that was all dispersed down the theatre that evening.
This helped us a great deal. We were able to get through far more digging and get rid of more sand than we'd ever been able to do before.
Yes, goodness. It brings back memories. There's no problem tunneling. The problem was shoring it up. And allied to that was getting the wood, enough wood to do so. Mainly came from bedboards.
If you take a kind of one board of everybody in the camp, it was 1,000 bedboards, which were about, I suppose, about 6 inches wide.
That's right.
And the width of a bunk bed, 2 foot or something long, and that was ideal for the tunnel.
This went on over a period of months, and the number of bedboards that were taken from each bed increased considerably until this mattress that you were on was sort of like that and so on, and we had to use string and all sorts of things in order to try and support the mattress.
You were 25 feet, 30 foot down, and no one knew you were there. You know, you couldn't very well tell the Germans, we've got a tunnel here, so if anything happens, would you dig us out fairly quickly? We did have falls at the digging end. The digger, he'd dig a few feet forward, and then it would collapse above him, and his number 2 would pull him as hard as he could out and get him out of it. But that was a bit frightening if you got covered in sand.
The Germans, in fact, had records of constant noises from their microphone system, which they put down to other causes than tunnelling. It seemed ludicrous that they should put microphones down to about 16 feet.
And then disbelieve them.
And there were 30-foot tunnels underneath with obviously there was some noise, thumps here, there, and chuff, 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 this sort of thing. How it came through, we don't know, because we were at the other end of it.
As far as noise is concerned, it was quite a good thing to have the gramophone going, which would fairly loud, or very loud, which would drown all the working that was going on.
You smell your own sweat and you smell sand, damp sand, usually damp sand anyway. And you don't think very deeply.
No, the only difficulty of the tunnel really was if you went down there and you kind of slightly in trouble because you'd eaten something a bit wrong. And when you were shut down in the tunnel, this was a bit difficult because you couldn't do much about it. And you'd kind of say to somebody, I must go. And they said, you get down that end, you know, and the other one said, you get back that end. And so you had to dig a little hole in the sand.
But with the deep tunnels, there was need, of course, for ventilation. And this basic idea of an air pump was developed before I was a prisoner, with this idea of a kit bag that could be filled with air and then collapsed and used as a pump, and supplied fresh air at the working face.
To jest fragment przewodu wentylacyjnego, który doprowadzał powietrze świeże do podkopów. Wykonane to było z puszek po konserwach, wykonane w ten sposób, że były wykonane cylindrycznie, że można było jedną umieszczać w drugiej i wtedy po prostu tworzyło to w jakiś sposób taką bardzo szczelną instalację wentylacyjną. Ten fragment broni został odnaleziony około 10 lat temu na terenie Stalagu Luft III i pierwotnie, z tego co mi wiadomo, był zamontowany na wieży strażniczej, która chroniła, żeby ewentualnie nie uciekali.
Operation Escape 200 was a brilliant, brilliant idea of Roger Bushell, and Roger Bushell alone, who decided that the only way we could make a war effort against the Germans was to make sure that the Germans were disrupted as much as we could disrupt them. And the only way to do it was to get out 200 officers. And that was his vision.
It was not, it was an effort by people who genuinely wanted to escape and get home and do their duty. And I really think that they didn't do it for the great escape, etc., etc. They did it because they wanted to get home.
No, I totally disagree with you. First of all, the whole camp didn't want to do their duty and get out. 600 officers worked on the Great Escape. There were many officers that were anti-escape. There were many officers that wanted to work on their law degrees and other things.
Well, I disagree. It rather sounds the way you put it, Sidney, that these people were not kind of RAF officers and British. They all were actually, but they just had different views.
It wasn't all just love and happiness. There were a lot of people that thought escaping was stupid. The war was coming close to an end. We were beginning to win it. And a lot of people didn't want to do it. There were people who refused to give up their bedboards. And I can tell you that. I could even name them if you want me to. But I won't.
I wouldn't like to say you are completely wrong, but I would like to say that I'm completely right.
And I'm on the right channel, I think I'm right, and you're on the left channel. You are very wrong.
The last digging teams emerged from Harry on the evening of March the 14th. The final weeks had been frantic, but the tunnel was now ready.
This is 100 feet on here, so if we do that 3 times, plus the 34,
that's right,
we should fall down the exit at the other end.
Absolutely right. Okay.
Okay, off.
Here we go.
You go, Gus.
The date of the escape was set for the moonless night of March the 24th.
Keep going.
Once the decision was made, teams of amateur cooks began
Starboard.
baking escape rations. And a small army of forgers stamped hundreds of passes and identity cards with the date of the escape. Now there was no turning back.
Come on, brother. You get across the road as far as I'm concerned. I have a feeling you go well.
200 officers were to escape.
That is how easier going underground.
Careful when it goes taut that you don't fall down the shaft.
The first 25 were selected by Roger Bushell as those most likely to make a successful home run.
Here we are.
The remainder were drawn from a hat.
Trees have grown up. Trees have grown.
Really, the wood would have started about...
No, this is roughly where it was.
The tunnel was 330 feet long and was designed to surface in the seclusion of the forest beyond the wire. The railway, used for hauling back the sand, was now at the disposal of the escapers. Electric lights were installed the whole length to help those who'd never been down the tunnel before. Towards dusk on March the 24th, the 200 men converged silently on Hut 104.
They emptied Hut 104 of the occupants who were not mixed up with the escape, and we all went in just before it got dark because they locked you in the huts after dark. So there were about 200 of us all there. Quite amazing really, because there were a couple of German soldiers wandering around in uniform, you know. It was quite frightening really.
What, not real German soldiers?
No, just going out in uniform.
Bob was a Swede. He had Swedish papers, and I had Romanian papers. We seemed an unlikely pair.
I was wearing my old RAF tunic with all the braid, of course, taken off, civilian buttons sewn on.
My jacket and trousers, they were service ones, and to make them look a bit non-service, I'd boiled them in a bucket of water with bindings from books, black books in, and that gave them a kind of a dirty, mottled, horrible-looking black.
But I had the inner linings of some flying boots, sheepskin, and I made these into a hat. So it was sort of a Cossacky style hat.
And a pair of old tropical trousers, and which I dirtied as much as I could to try and make myself look like a Yugoslav workman. And oh, I had a compass and a map, and that was about it.
I don't think anybody was terrified, or anything like terrified. We were a bit apprehensive, but no, one was very keen to go because it looked as though it was at last going to work.
The teams went down, Johnny Bull, John Marshall and Roger Bushell, who were going to open the tunnel up. They'd left it about a foot, 2 foot to go. They took quite a long time, and messages came back that they'd had difficulty opening up the tunnel.
Johnny Bull and Johnny Marshall trying to get this trap door open, knowing that it had frozen over. Nobody had allowed for that. Once Johnny did open it, he was the one who put his head out and saw, my God, we're 30 yards short, 30 feet short. So, well, I'll tell you how short we were. We're from here to that tree. We were supposed to be right in the forest, and we weren't. So what the hell do we do now? Johnny shot down to the bottom of the shaft and said, what the hell do we do, Roger? We're short. Roger said, how short? We're a lot short.
So they then decided on a plan of action of having a rope tied to a tree going to the end of the tunnel One would go to the wood and pull the rope when it was clear, when the guard was not in that area.
Roger gave the instructions, 1 pull, stop, 2 pulls, go. And then having done that, he sort of shook hands, cheerio Dynamo, he said, see you in London, and off he went.
Well, I gathered up my stuff and I climbed down the shaft. It was like going down the hold of a ship. You were hauled up to the first halfway house, which was Piccadilly. Then you changed trains, and then you were hauled up to the next halfway house, which was Leicester Square. And you had to lie full length out on the trolley, and it appeared to be quite fast, of course. You had your nose just off the line. Chaps took it in turns to pull the escapers up the tunnel, and then they took their own turn and then went out themselves. They were hauled up to the exit. I must say it was a very nice way of leaving a prison camp, of escaping, and there you were standing in the exit hole looking up at the stars.
The tunnel that night was electrically lit so that the chaps could get through quite easily, really. But there was an air raid on Berlin, and all the electricity went off. And so we were in the dark.
And we then had to start lighting the lamps that we used to dig with. This, once again, slowed things down.
Just after midnight, it became clear that not everyone would make it. So it was decided that once the first 80 were through, the tunnel would be sealed up. But the problems were not yet over.
A lot of the chaps escaping hadn't actually been down the tunnel before, and some of them didn't like it very much, and they tended to, disturb the fittings and to cause small sand falls, and so all of those damages had to be repaired on the spot, and so that took time as well.
4.5 hours, I think, because it was about 1 o'clock before I actually got out of the tunnel.
I should have got out much earlier, and so I pulled a few extra people up, and then suddenly old Wings Day's rugged face appeared and said, Sidney, what the bloody hell are you doing here? You'll miss your train, you're not supposed to be sitting here. And I said, well, my relief didn't turn up. He said, well, he's down at Piccadilly. He said, never mind, out you go, I'll take over from you. So old Wings took over from me and gave me a kick up the backside to get up the old ladder. And so up the ladder I went and looked out, put my head left and right, and then saw this great expanse of white snow. Then suddenly you realize you've got to get over into the forest. So you slither on your belly as fast as you can. It's the biggest speed you can possibly get to get to the forest. And once you get into the forest, then you shake all the snow off you, and Johnny, who was there, says, go, out you go.
The air outside the wire was entirely different from the air inside, because it's the air of freedom. You were outside the wire.
This is a most marvelous feeling. When you get outside, you see that wire and you see the huts there, and you thank God we've made it.
My turn came to go out, and we'd received a message to say they were closing the tunnel down after we had got out. And at that moment, the guard decided to go and spend a penny and walk straight across the entrance to the tunnel. As soon as I heard the shot, we realized immediately that the tunnel had been found. I shot backwards up the tunnel as fast as I could back to Leicester Square. Once we were all out of the tunnel, we put the stove back over and it was all kind of looked just normal. And then wandered around the room, and people were burning their money because they didn't want the Germans to kind of have it back. And we were all eating our chocolate bars, everything. We thought we're not going to lose these type of thing. So they were practically making themselves sick. I think, had given another 10 minutes and we would have all been out. And that would have been, the tunnel would have been closed down and they wouldn't have known anything about it until Appel, which was when we were counted, the next morning.
Ken Rees was to have been 78th through the tunnel, but only 76 got out.
I really was almost in tears. I don't think I've ever been so disappointed in my life. I could have cried, actually, as I sat in the cell in the cooler, thinking, God, all this work, my big chance of escape and getting home was gone.
The escapers fanned out into the Silesian countryside. Many made for the local railway station, where they hoped to catch a train north to Stettin or south towards the Czechoslovakian border. Although one of the first to get out of Harry, Sidney Dowse didn't reach the station until nearly dawn.
Walk through here, slowly, seeing God knows how many Crees, escapees from Harry, hanging around still at this hour of the morning. And I thought, my goodness. Came up slowly to this counter here. I kept back a little bit because I didn't want the girls to see me, the ticket girls at the time, in case they recognized me. My train that I wanted to catch, I'd missed, and I had a long time to wait for the next train. So then we walked out and went back into the woods, bypassed Sargon, made for the railway lines, and then it poured. The rain came down then on top of all this. So everything was slush, absolutely torrential.
The breakout created a state of national alert. Within hours of the discovery of the tunnel, the hunt was on.
The bridges were all guarded by Hitlerjugend and everybody else. There were thousands of Germans were mobilized on this search. And so we were having to ford flooded streams, and we were getting very wet and so on, and then freezing conditions at night. So after 2 or 3 days in the woods, we were suffering very badly from exposure.
The bad weather reduced further the already slim chances of getting home. Within days, most of the escapers were recaptured. Many were taken to the local Gestapo headquarters. When Hitler was told of the escape, he flew into a rage. 50 officers were selected for immediate execution. They were driven in 2s and 3s into the Silesian countryside and shot in the back of the head.
We thought there, but for the grace of God, go we, without any question, because we no idea of the method of selection. We'd all been in these cells in the Gestapo jail together, and out of every 3, 2 had been killed and 1 survived, so we were undoubtedly very lucky.
The bodies were cremated. The urns containing the ashes were brought back to the camp.
I don't think I believed it, and I think a lot of us didn't believe it, even with the urns. We didn't really believe it. It wasn't conceivable.
It was disbelief, it was anger, it was fury, it was a determination that it wouldn't stop future escapes.
The camp was absolutely stunned, you know, it was absolutely silent. People were absolutely horrified at this mass murder it was really. I don't think you can say much more on that, really.
Ładuj! Salvo! Pal! Ładuj! Salvo! Pal! Ładuj! Salvo! Pal!
With that casualty rate of 50 people dead, I don't really think it was a great escape. I think it would have been a great escape if we'd got 50 back to England with only 3 killed. And if we'd only on that kind of casualty rate, I'd have been willing to accept it.
Only 3 made it home after the Great Escape. 2 Norwegians and a Dutchman. Of the 23 other survivors, Sidney Dowse spent 10 days walking east towards Poland, but he was eventually picked up. He was taken to the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen. There he found 3 other hairy escapers, including Jimmy James. Risking almost certain death, they immediately set about digging another tunnel, and within months had escaped again. Again they were recaptured. This time they were sent to Sachsenhausen's notorious cell block. Both men spent 5 months in solitary confinement, expecting each day to be their last. They were saved by the German capitulation. Dick Churchill and Bob Nelson ended their war back in Stalag Luft III. As did Henry Lamond, who'd never got down into the tunnel that night. Along with Andrew Wiseman and Ken Rees, they sat out the final year of the conflict.
I think the world at large should remember Auschwitz and Belsen much more than the 50. Those of us who were in Luft 3 should remember the 52.
The film treatment of a remarkable wartime escape can be seen later tonight on BBC Two. The Wooden Horse is at 11:30.